We're working on the movie for 37th Parallel, working on the movie for Bitcoin Billionaires, and I have a couple other projects in the works in film and television. I recently wrote for the show Billions on Showtime. I was a producer and writer for season 5 of Billions, which was really, really fun. And so those are kind of the main projects right now, but I'm always looking for that next big nonfiction story.
So you said you mentioned you're writing the screenplay for
Yes.
the movie you sold to Spielberg?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've written a screenplay?
This will be my first screenplay for a major studio. I've written an independent film here or there that hasn't been made. So I've written some scripts before. I tried to adapt one of my earlier books once. So I've done some screenwriting, and I wrote for Billions, which was television, but this will be my first major feature film. Yeah.
What's the biggest change for you writing a screenplay versus writing a book?
Well, you don't realize when you're writing a book how much of the story is just taking place in the characters' heads, because an awful lot of it is. Every time they see something and think about it, there's got to be a way to show that. Nothing appears in the screenplay that doesn't appear on screen. So there can't ever be any interior thought. There can't ever be any explanation. There can't be description really beyond something that you would visually see. So that's a big transformation for a writer. Most book writers aren't as cinematic. Now, I've always written for movies in a way. So all of my books are somewhat like that, which critics sometimes don't like. They often review my book saying this should be a movie and not a book. But for me, it's probably an easier transition than some authors. But yeah, it's a learning curve. I mean, it's a process to learn the format and how to make sure everything you put in there appears on the screen. I love being a book writer, and I've always wanted to write books. But I've always seen the book as a platform for telling the story. I've always wanted my books to be bigger and live beyond just the bookstore. My goal is to be Michael Crichton. And what I always was fascinated and loved about him was he would tell a story and it would be almost seamless, and how it became this huge movie like Jurassic Park or a television show or something like that, or Westworld. I mean, it's just, the idea is I'm a storyteller. I don't care how you devour that story. I don't care if someone's
to a medium.
No, I don't care if someone tells you that story. I don't care if I'm on YouTube or do, something like that. I only care that you are hearing the story and enjoy it, And so my goal is to tell these stories in as big a way as I can. For me, it's been movies. It's been writing a book that can become a movie. If you write a book that can't become a movie, it has a shelf life. You know what I'm saying? It's like doing it in a much smaller way than it could be done. And you're only going to reach a certain number of people. There has to be that bigger dream, in a lot of ways. You have to delude yourself when you sit down to do a project that everyone in the world is going to read it, or everyone in the world is going to see it, or everyone in the world is going to hear it. That's the only way I can do it. I can't sit down and write a book because it would be a few people would like it. It's just never been me. There are writers who do that, who write wonderful stories, and they do it because there's a great story there. For me, it needs to be bigger than that. And it needs to be entertainment for a lot of people. I guess I've always kind of been driven that way. I never want to just write a book. That was never my goal. My goal was always to be a storyteller in as big a way as possible, to write 20 books, to have 10 movies, to have 10 television shows. I want that. And so I think that's always what's driven me. So I won't sit down to start that process if I don't already think it's got that life beyond the pages.
That's a really cool way of looking at it. Like, you can see potential way beyond just pages of a book. That's one of my favorite things about you, is that you do so many of these talks online, like on YouTube or whatnot, so many podcasts, so many, whatever it is, TV shows, movies. It's a really cool way of, you are all about the story, not about the medium itself.
Absolutely, 100%. And what I've seen gone on, listen, when I started my career, there was none of this. None of this existed, right? And now the world you were in, the podcast world, or what's happening on the internet, and then the streamers, you look at what's going on in the streaming world, it's wonderful. We're at such a golden age of storytelling because there's so many ways to tell a story, and there's not as many sort of walls as there were. Anybody with a great story can find a way to tell it, which is also bad because anyone with a great story can find a way to tell it. But the goal is that if you can live in this new world, if you can figure out ways to tell your story in as big a way as you can, you can be very successful now. And so I love it. I was able to transition because I've always looked at it that way. I was always looking at it as just not books, because to be honest, books are not doing that well. The book business is a very different business than it was in the 90s, because people still read, but there's so many ways to read now. And there's so much competition in terms of what you want to do with your day. You just look at Netflix and Hulu and all of this kind of stuff, and where's their time to sit down and read a book? And so
even audiobooks are huge.
Audiobooks are huge, and I love it. Listen, I love it. I think it's fantastic because I can tell a story that someone can listen to in an audiobook, or someone else can watch as a movie, or someone else sees on a streamer, someone else hears a podcast about, or someone else sees my TED talk about. There's a million ways for you to get, you know, the 37th Parallel is a perfect example, where that's a story which has reached so many people. It's not a book that sold so many copies, but I know the story has reached so many people. And I think, to me, that's great. And so that's always been my goal. And it's just to reach as many people as I can with my stories. And so, yeah, I won't sit down to do a project unless I see it having that life. And so, yeah, it's fun.
That's awesome. I don't know how much time you have. Is it cool if we talk about the Russian story, or?
Yeah, we can do a little bit. I don't have that much time left, but
okay,
we can get into the Russia story a little
okay.
bit. Yeah.
I eventually, by the way, one day I want to get you here in the studio to talk, because it's so much of a different vibe. We're getting one-on-one, and I find you so fascinating, man.
Thank you. Yeah, no, when this all ends, I'll be down there, because my parents are right down the street, so I'll be down there.
That's perfect. Yeah. I'm gonna hold you to it.
Yeah.
So tell me about the Once Upon a Time in Russia. How did that story come about? Tell me a brief background on that.
Yeah. So I never intended to write about Russian oligarchs. Let's just put that on the table right now. Yeah. I don't think it's wise to write about Russian oligarchs. I think that's something most writers should stay away from. Basically, I got a call from a big Hollywood director, who was always pitching me stories that were really dangerous. He'd continually pitch me stories that were about, like, gun runners in Miami or drug dealers and wherever. And I'd say, how dangerous on a scale of 1 to 10? And he'd be like, oh, they're an 8. I'm like, I'm not going to do an 8. I want to do a 2. So one day he calls me up and he's like, I got this incredible story. I want you to come to London and meet these guys, but I'm not going to tell you what it's about. And I was like, well, why won't you tell me? He goes, because if I tell you, you won't come. And I was like, well, that doesn't sound great, but I decided to go. So I flew to London.
Who is this guy, by the way?
Brett Ratner, the director, Brett.
Okay. Did he do the Gun Runner with Jonah Hill?
I believe he was involved in the production of that story. Brett did Hercules. He did the Rush Hour movies.
Okay.
And then he got Me Too'd out of existence. But anyways, pre-Me Too.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. So I go to London, and there's this bar. I'm supposed to meet him at this bar. And when I get to the bar, there's all the security outside. There's all these, like, armored limousines and, you know, these guys with earpieces on. It was just a crazy scene. So I go in the bar, and sitting at the bar is a very famous Russian oligarch. Billionaire, dangerous person, you know, as these Russian oligarchs often is. And I immediately think, oh God, there's no way I'm going to be involved in this story. But I sit down, and they proceed to tell me this incredible story of how these oligarchs basically put Putin in power, how these guys made billions and billions of dollars, essentially looting Russia. And then Putin, once they put him in power, chased them all out of Russia, that everyone who stood up to Putin is either dead or in exile. And the oligarchs who stuck with Putin are still oligarchs today. And it was this incredible story. It's about Boris Berezovsky, who was one of the wealthiest men in Russia until he went against Putin, and then was eventually found hanging in his bathroom from a scarf. Roman Abramovich, who was a young orphan from Siberia making children's dolls, who then became the biggest oil magnate in Russia in his 20s, was partnered with Berezovsky, and then ended up staying on Putin's good side and basically paying off Berezovsky to go away. And then Berezovsky was found hanging. So it's an incredible story, intense people. I spent a year going back and forth to London to meet with these people, having terrifying conversations. I remember one conversation. There's a scene in the book where Roman Abramovich and Boris Berezovsky and a couple of other Russians need to get this guy called a Red Director, who runs a Siberian oil plant, to sign off on their deal. So they fly to Siberia and meet with this guy, and he says, no, I'm not going to sign this deal. So they fly back to Moscow, and that night, that man goes swimming in the Irkutsk River and drowns. His bodyguard, who is the only witness, gets into a bar fight and dies. So I write this scene, and then I call up the oligarchs, and I'm like, you know, the scene, it seems like you guys had his guy killed. And they go, well, it seems that way, yes. And I was like, well, is it okay that I write the scene like this? And they said, oh yeah, that's totally fine. And I was like, well, why is it fine to write a scene in which you guys obviously had somebody murdered? And they said, well, you have to look at 1990s Russia, not like 1990s America. Look at 1990s Russia like 1890s America. In the 1890s, if someone refused you, you killed him. And it wasn't a big deal. That's how business was done in the 1890s. And so in 1990s in Russia, that's how business was done. And they were very matter of fact about it. And these are really intense dudes, but it's just an incredible story. And it tells you more about Putin than I think anything else has. If you read my book, Once Upon a Time in Russia, you will understand Putin in a way that I don't think our government understands Putin, that I don't think most politicians have ever understood Putin. Putin has been underestimated from day one. When the oligarchs found him, he was a low-level KGB agent who was working for the mayor of St. Petersburg. Boris Berezovsky and this group of oligarchs were looking for someone to replace Yeltsin. Yeltsin was old, he was drunk, he was dying, and they needed a new president of Russia, but they wanted someone they could control. Boris Berezovsky knew Putin because once he'd set up a car dealership in St. Petersburg, and Putin had greased the wheels for him. So he flew to St. Petersburg, he got Putin, he said, we're going to install you. So they installed Putin as president. The first thing Putin did was he invited all the oligarchs to Stalin's old house. This is a house where there are bullet holes in the walls because Stalin used to line people up there and shoot them. So he invites all the oligarchs there and he sits down with them and he says, you've all made an enormous amount of money. You're all incredibly wealthy. You can all keep your money, but from here on out, you stay out of my way. And on that day, everything in Russia changed. Any of the oligarchs who stayed out of Putin's way are still oligarchs today worth billions of dollars. Any of the oligarchs who stood up to Putin are either dead or in exile or in jail. And there was no middle ground. Putin was one of these people that, like, he knew from the very minute it's all about Russia. His greatest regret was that Russia was no longer the Soviet Union. He really and truly believed that it should be what it was under Stalin and that he would be the leader for life. And from the very beginning, he was set out. Now, he's beloved in Russia. Often people ask me, are the oligarchs going to band together and get rid of Putin? It's the other way around. Is Putin going to get rid of the oligarchs? They love Putin because Putin is a very strong leader.